It's time now for Countywide, a special presentation of Yavapai Broadcasting News. Join Paul David and Jen Cohen as they talk with our community's leaders, newsmakers, and people in the know. You'll hear about the hot topics that affect all our lives in Yavapai County. And now, here's today's Countywide.
Hello and welcome to Countywide. I'm your host, Jen Cohen. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we are talking about the Sedona Home Rule with City Manager Justin Clifton. Now you're going to want to check out sedonaaz.gov/elections. That's going to have a lot of information that we're going to talk about today. We'll be referencing that website a lot, so make sure you write that down or stick it in your brain right now. sedonaaz.gov/elections. Justin, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent, excellent. You're doing a bang-up job as the Sedona City Manager.
Well, thank you. Not without challenges, but we work hard.
Yes, yeah, you do, and you've been at it 3 years now.
Yes.
And that's great, and you foresee yourself continuing on.
Oh, I love Sedona. I couldn't think of a better place to be.
Excellent. I agree with you completely, so. We're two biased people sitting here. So let's talk about the Sedona Home Rule. Most people know about what a home rule is, but just in case, let's cover that.
Yeah, it's sometimes a little more complicated than some people think. So home rule is really a product of an amendment to the Arizona Constitution that was passed by the voters in 1980. That amendment essentially sets a spending limit, a state-imposed spending limit on cities and towns in Arizona. Now, where home rule comes in is to the extent a community determines that that spending limit is just too low, that it doesn't provide for the level of service that that community and its residents desire. Home rule is one way that the community can get out from under that state-imposed limit. And essentially what home rule does is allow the local government to set its own budget. Now, that's a balanced budget based on available resources, but basically the city council at that point with home rule authority can say, hey, we've heard our residents, we know what the priorities are, we're going to allocate dollars where we think we need to, and the checks and balances in that system is the two-year election cycle. Importantly, it doesn't impact the tax rate at all. So citizens would continue to pay the same tax that they did whether home rule passes or fails. But essentially if the home rule fails, we live with the state-imposed limit. If home rule passes, the city council continues to set its own budget.
Interesting. And it seems outrageous to me that the state set a budget in the 80s and everyone's supposed to still stick to it from the 80s. Yeah,
now that limit does adjust by population and inflation, but it doesn't adjust for certain things like utilities. So what's interesting about this is the state-imposed limit and this constitutional amendment's created in 1980. Sedona's incorporated in 88. So there really was no prior spending for the city of Sedona per se. So they created a limit based on kind of looking around the state and extrapolating a per capita spending and said, Sedona, here's your limit. And okay, that's fine. But it was a few years after that that the state regulators came in and said, Sedona, you need to build a wastewater facility. Now, the wastewater expenses aren't excluded from that state limit. So essentially, if the city was going to abide by the state limit after creating a utility, it would have to account for that in the state limit. And cut other services in order to comply, most likely. So home rules voted on every 4 years. There are other ways that cities and towns can seek alternatives to that state-imposed limit. Home rule is the most common. So if you get that authority, Sedona's been fortunate to have that for the last 22 years, and really every election except one in Sedona's history, home rule has passed. But the consequence is every 4 years you have to ask again for permission.
Right.
Yeah.
Mother may I.
Yes.
Kind of thing. Okay. Yes. So then if the taxes don't increase, where does the money come from for when home rule passes? Yeah.
So essentially the city doesn't levy a property tax. Most of its revenue comes in from sales tax and bed taxes. There are some other things, state shared revenues, grants and things like that. But those would still be the revenue sources either way. The difference, to put it in context, is the city projects a budget of $49.5 million in fiscal year 20. Now we're on that odd fiscal year that actually starts in July. So that fiscal year starts July 1, 2019. So budget would be 49.5. The state imposed limit is 13.5.
Oh.
So pretty big difference, right? Now there are a number of expenses that are excluded from the state limit. Things like debt. You know, needless to say, you've got to pay your bonds, right? You're not going to reduce those costs without, you know, being delinquent or you know, failing to make your payments. So essentially, you've got the 13.5 and then up to $10.8 million in exclusions. You have to get into some nuance in the budget to understand what of those you could really spend and what you couldn't spend in the case that Home Rule failed. But when you add those two together, you're essentially cutting 51% of your proposed budget, the one we project we would have under Home Rule, if Home Rule failed and we were subject to the state imposed limit.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, 51%. Big number.
Yes.
Now that's a number based on the budget. Actual spending varies from year to year depending on exactly how the year unfolds. But it's pretty drastic. To put that in further context, you can't just go into an organization and cut 51% across the board.
Right.
There are certain programs that just can't endure those kinds of cuts. And there are services that the city can't just walk away from. So I mentioned the wastewater facility earlier. It was the state regulators that made us create that utility, and they would make us maintain that utility. You can't walk away from it. If we were to spend what is projected to be spent in fiscal year 20, which is about $5.7 million in operations and capital, you'd be cutting the rest of the budget 77% to comply with this state-imposed limit. If in addition to funding that wastewater facility, you funded the police department at projected budget spending levels, you'd be cutting the rest of the budget 96%. So in that scenario, you've got a handful of things like debt payments that are preserved, some money that comes in from the state, your wastewater and your police, and you'd be cutting virtually everything else. Now, that's not meant to be a plan. Obviously, you wouldn't organize the budget that way even in the event that Home Rule failed. But I think it helps create context on how drastic the difference between the spending at a Home Rule level and the spending under a state-imposed limit might be.
Yes, that is extremely drastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds terribly scary, actually, to have to cut all of that stuff.
I think it could be. It's interesting. City Council has asked me to take a closer look at things because, again, that anecdotal scenario, that hypothetical scenario, just creates context, but that wouldn't reflect the plan in the case that Home Rule failed. So I've been looking at something more like a plan, and it's been interesting to try to evaluate what services do you absolutely have to have. Things like wastewater. There are other things that are statutorily required. We have to have a municipal court, for instance. We have to employ a city clerk, believe it or not. So you account for some of those things. And then next you start to look at what is absolutely critical. Most people would agree some level of law enforcement is pretty critical. But there are other things that we do that some people might not even know. For instance, we inspect buildings when they're built, and that ensures that they stay standing and that they're safe, et cetera, et cetera. I would argue that you have to maintain some of those services, and I think most citizens would agree. By the time you get through some of those essential services, the ones that are either required by law or that most people would agree you need it at some level, there's not much left to go into the kinds of things that tend to equate to community in most people's minds. Parks and recreation. We run a municipal pool. We have a dog park, things like that. It would be hard to fund any of those things, to be honest. And similarly, we partner with external organizations, mostly nonprofits, to provide certain services like the library. Those contracts are fairly robust, and many of those organizations depend on those funds to continue to provide services. It would be very difficult to fund those.
It sounds like
either.
There'd be a lot of difficulties. We're going to take our first short break. We are talking with Sedona City Manager Justin Clifton. Check out sedonaaz.gov/elections. We've got more countywide, so don't go away. We'll be right back.
This is Bruce Morrow, Transportation Manager for Cottonwood Area Transit. Remember, we cover the entire Verde Valley and Sedona. Cottonwood Area Transit has you covered wherever you want to ride in the Verde Valley, all day, every day. Take Cottonwood Area Transit through Clarkdale, Verde Village, and from 26 locations in Cottonwood. With Verde Links, it's a quick and easy trip to Sedona every day. Don't forget our connectors to Camp Verde. Visit cottonwoodaz.gov for Cottonwood Area Transit and take a seat. Let's go ride.
How I define making, in the broadest possible terms, it is making something extant in the world that didn't exist. Everybody who's ever made anything is bringing something into fruition for a reason, and that act in and of itself makes us stewards of our culture. It's something that we're talking about. It's a response. Actually, it's telling a story. That's really what it is. And I include everything that could be made: painting, sculpture, welding, all of that.
Yellow is positive.
When a kid gets their hands on the world and learns that they can make their fantasy play, that they can make their reality, that's power. And as far as I'm concerned, everyone should feel that kind of power. There we go. If there's something that interests you to bring into the world, that's fantastic. Go figure out how to do it. Go tell your own story. There it is. And so I want to know why you make. Let's go.
Share your own Why I Make story today. Visit whyimake.org.
150 over 90.
180 over 111.
160 over 110. I had a stroke.
This is what high blood pressure looks like. You might not feel its symptoms, but the results from a stroke are far from invisible or silent. If you've come off your treatment plan, get back on it, or talk with your doctor to create an exercise, diet, and medication plan that works for you. Go to loweryourhbp.org.
If I would have followed a treatment plan, I would not be in this situation.
And welcome back to Countywide. I'm your host, Jen Cohen. We're talking with Sedona City Manager Justin Clifton. You're going to check out sedonaaz.gov/elections. That's what you're going to need to look about. Sedona Home Rule. That's what we're talking about today. Justin's been expounding on all the... So let's jump back into what happens if it doesn't pass. What do we lose that we have?
I should emphasize that it's difficult to say exactly what we would lose, and that's because our city council approves the budget. We also utilize a citizen work group every year to help us vet programs, to help us understand potential cost savings, where we should be spending money, etc. So we would preserve that process even in the event that home rule failed and we were subject to that state-imposed limit. But as I mentioned, I've been asked to start to prepare some analysis to look at, okay, realistically, it's one thing to say you might have to cut 51%, or in a certain hypothetical scenario, more than 60 or more than 70 or whatever. But how do you do it? You know, what do you cut, I think ends up being the question. So I think first and foremost, you preserve those things that are subject to the exclusions. Okay, so those are things like your debt service. You're not going to default on debt. Second, you start to address those things that are statutorily required. I mentioned some of those. Third, you start to look at what is critical to running a community. And that's maybe a subject of debate, but there are a lot of things that people might not even understand, or they're not the first things we think of when we think of what are the services that my government provides. For instance, I think we largely take it for granted that if we go visit one of Sedona's parks and we use the public restroom and it's stocked with toilet paper and it's relatively clean and all those things, well, we employ people to do that. You know, so that's one of those services that I wouldn't say for sure that it would be cut, but after you start to look at the things that are really, really critical, maintaining roads, maintaining a police department, doing some of the development review things that need to be done, it gets harder and harder to address things like cleaning the restrooms. You know, we clean gum off sidewalks in Uptown, you know, and that's something that you wouldn't know because we keep them pretty clean, you know, so before you step in gum and think to yourself, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? That's taken care of. We do a number of special events. Our Parks and Rec department has some really great programs for adults, for kids. I mentioned we run a community pool. They put on the food truck festival, you know, so they have kids camps throughout the summertime. They do a spring event that attracts kids throughout the Verde Valley. So those are some of the services that we provide that would be vulnerable in a situation where home rule failed. So the list is fairly large in terms of the direct services. But the other thing that people might not notice that is still pretty important is it takes some organization, some infrastructure, you know, people, departments to run a city. So we have IT. We have finance. You know, somebody's got to process the revenues we get, the checks we cut for expenses, etc. We have an HR department, very small one, and even some of the behind the scenes things that people might not always see. They see our cops on the roads, but they don't necessarily see our dispatchers behind the scene taking that 911 call. That's a department where most of the time we've got one person answering the phone. You can't cut that department. Doing so would mean someone doesn't answer when they call 911.
Scary.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So now moving forward, if Home Rule should pass, what types of things are you looking forward to in the future, say for the fiscal year 2020?
Sure.
What are we going to look forward to?
Our city council has a number of top priorities, the biggest of which is traffic. You know, we're a tourist economy. Life has been good from the perspective of growing economic base, et cetera, but it comes with impacts. Biggest impact, I think, according to most people that live in Sedona, is traffic. So the city council had authorized a pretty significant transportation master plan that we completed over the last 2 years, and now we've got a number of big projects identified. So we're ready to go. We're even designing some of those projects. I don't know that those would be funded in a situation where Home Rule fails and if we're subject to the state imposed limit. So that's a pretty big one, a big priority. A lot of dollars have been allocated, and I don't know that we could complete those projects. Another one is housing. So in a growing tourist economy and in a place where housing was already expensive, and because of a lot of short-term rental activity that was a result of state laws, we see diminished available housing. Very hard to employ our local workforce, and just costs are going up all around. So another one of those council priorities is to look for partnerships and ways that we can help lower the cost of housing, and that generally means spending some money. Again, something that we may not be able to do in the case of the state-imposed limit. One other priority that was just recently established was to be more assertive in trying to advance sustainability goals. So we recently created a program and did so repurposing some money that had been spent in another department. So it wasn't a new expense, but one that would still be subject to this state-imposed limit. And we're just about to hire a sustainability coordinator to really lead those initiatives. And that would be another thing that I think would be very difficult to fund.
And a super important thing for any town these days. Sustainability is a hot topic right now. So to bring in someone to do that for Sedona, considering the impacts of the tourism, which is a huge percentage. I mean, what else have we got in Sedona besides tourism and the impacts that go with that? And to hear that you're addressing the traffic is wonderful. I know that's a huge concern for a lot of people. Though traffic in Sedona is still, it's not LA. So that's traffic. Phoenix, that's traffic.
But it is relative,
but,
and to the point of local control. And I think it's fair to say that Home Rule is about local control. And you know, the state-imposed limit is what it sounds like. It's a state-imposed limit. So our local council has the advantage of understanding what our citizens want. And that's, I think, what you get. You see traffic, housing, sustainability. There's a community plan that's adopted by the voters, and we adhere to that plan. There are 6 major outcomes identified in that plan, and those are 3 of them: sustainability, housing, environmental stewardship, or sustainability. So in a way, a Home Rule is kind of the authorization to really pursue that plan fully without limits to spending available revenues. I'll reiterate, because that's something that people often miss. The tax rate isn't changed. So when we set a budget at 49.5, it's because we have that much money. In the case that Home Rule fails, that much money is still sitting there. It's in a bank account or doing something else. It just can't be spent. So to some people, they might say that the irony of this is, you know, they're paying the same bill, they're just not getting the same service.
Yeah, that is true. So Sedona residents will be voting on the Home Rule proposal on August 28th in the primary election. Check out sedonaaz.gov/elections. We are talking Sedona Home Rule with City Manager Justin Clifton. We've got to take a few more minutes of break, but we'll be right back, so don't go away.
It appears these hot ashes are about to be dumped, which could possibly start a wildfire. How will Smokey deal with such a hot situation? The garden hose defense. Next, a thorough stir. Then another spray. And finally, feeling if the ashes are cool. Ah yes, the selfie. A ritual practiced so frequently with this tribe, but not so much by Smokey Bear.
Only you can prevent wildfires. making was a big part of the foundation of what I wanted my children to do and to have fun with.
Growing up in the Bushnell house was like nutty professor craziness. I know, that's true.
Getting burned on a hot glue gun, that was okay. You know, burning themselves with a soldering iron, that was okay.
I was 6 when I learned how to solder.
We learned how to paint, we learned how to sheetrock, and all these things had such lasting impact.
I felt that creativity would give them entree into being able to do anything they wanted.
Whatever we showed our dad, it was always the coolest thing in the world to him.
Good ideas are very often considered silly at their onset.
And by that definition, we haven't even really grown up, you know? I mean, the projects have just gotten bigger.
We all make and have fun. Now the question is, why do you make?
Share your own Why I Make story today. Visit whyiMake.org.
Welcome back to Countywide. Just a few seconds left. We're talking about the Sedona Home Rule with City Manager Justin Clifton. Check out sedonaz.gov/elections. Okay, so the Home Rule proposal is coming onto the August 28th primary election ballot. That's when you've got to make your decision.
Yes, absolutely. And I should clarify, you know, I'm here to try to present the facts of Home Rule, you know, what the state imposed limit would be, what our projected budget would be, etc. Not trying to influence people on how they should vote. In fact, I would encourage people to listen to arguments on both sides. We collected pro-con statements that we put out in the information packet that people receive with their ballots, so that's a good source to get some review of arguments on both sides. And I'm sure there will be groups in Sedona pushing, you know, a vote one way or the other. And ultimately, my goal is that people are educated, and when they cast their vote, they're casting their vote the way they intend.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And to have been completely educated on the subject. Of course, anytime you vote, it's always good to be educated, educate yourself. So definitely go to the website, check out, talk to your neighbors. You know, what else would you suggest?
Yeah, I think that's a big one. I would also emphasize that, you know, we're always available at the local government. You can come to the counter, you can give a call, you can send an email, and we do occasionally get people asking questions. I understand that these days people are probably frustrated with government all the way around. But my experience is when people engage and they ask a question about why is a service a certain way, why is a park function the way it does, or whatever, something that they don't like, they always learn something. We reduce these things to sound bites, but ultimately we provide a pretty critical and complicated and complex service to our local residents. And if people are wondering what that really means, they could always call us, send us an email, and we'd be happy to explain further what we do and what people get for their investment in us with their tax dollars.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent. That's a good thing to know. And again, of course, you've said it a bunch of times, but whether the home rule passes, it doesn't affect the taxes.
That's right.
That's where everybody goes. All the alarms go off. Oh my gosh, my taxes are going to go up. This is completely separate from that. The money that supports that budget, that section of the budget, comes from sales tax revenue.
That's right. So a yes vote on home rule basically means City Council continues to set the budget, projected to be about $49.5 million by FY20. A no vote on home rule means we're subject to the state imposed limit of about 13.5, plus some exclusions that might mean cutting somewhere in the neighborhood of 50+ % of the budget.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that money is still coming in, but it's going into the bank instead of into the city.
That's right. It sits in the bank account. And there are some other factors with those exclusions. It might mean the city takes on more debt, because debt is one of those things that's excluded. Mm-hmm. So in order to do some of those capital projects and do some of the other things citizens demand, mm-hmm. if home rule fails, it might mean taking on more debt. I think we're in a good position that we can cash fund some of those things because we've saved money over the last number of years.
Great, great, great. Justin, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you. Check out Sedona Home Rule. You're going to go to sedonaz.gov/elections. City Manager Justin Clifton. That's all the time we have for Countywide. We'll see you next time.